Yes, Aishwarya, you can begin now.
Hello, everybody. A very good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Diabetes, the Silent Killer, Insulin Dosing in the Critical Care and Diabetic Ketoacidosis. Thank you for taking out time and being here today. Our today's honorable speaker is Dr. Anupam Biswas, sir, MBBS MD in General Medicine, DM in Endocrinology. Dr. Anupam Biswas is currently working as a consultant endocrinologist at Aditya Birla Memorial Hospital. He has published articles in national and international journals. He is a regular speaker at the state and the national platform. He also is a reviewer of the national journals. We have highly obliged to have such an eminent speaker amongst us today. I would like to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Anupam Biswas, on behalf of our President, Dr. Ayush Gandhi, Vice President, Dr. Shubham More, our Secretary, Monish Thorat, and Joint Secretary, Sheikh Noor. It's a request to all the participants, kindly mute your mic and switch off your camera during the presentation. In the end of the webinar, we'll have a question and answer session. So kindly note down your questions. I welcome you, sir, and request you to proceed with the webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Am I audible? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So today I'm going to speak about management of diabetes with management of diabetic ketoacidosis and how to manage diabetes in the critical care, especially your ICU setup. Okay, so before going into diabetic ketoacidosis, there are few important slides which I want you people to know. So something which we regularly come across, and I keep asking my MBBS students and even the MD medicine students about diabetes and some of the very basic knowledge about diabetes. So I'll share it with you today, and I'm hopeful that you will remember it in the long run. Okay, so coming to the first slide. So this is one of the most important slides. So I'm going through the basics first. Okay, so first and foremost is how to diagnose diabetes. So what is the criteria for the diagnosis of diabetes? So this is one very general question, which somehow when I ask my students or RMOs on rounds, no one is able to tell me the correct definition of diagnosis of diabetes. So what is the definition? A fasting plasma glucose greater than 126 is defined as diabetes. So there are four criteria for the diagnosis of diabetes. One, fasting plasma glucose greater than 126 mg per dl. Second, 2-hour plasma glucose, that is your post meals blood glucose. 2 hours post meal blood glucose greater than 200 mg per dl. So you should remember the fasting plasma glucose should be done after a caloric restriction of at least 8 hours. So a fasting of at least 8 to 10 hours and fasting plasma glucose more than 126. Your postprandial plasma glucose, after food plasma glucose more than 200. And HbA1c. HbA1c, as you all know, is an average of 3-month blood glucose. So an HbA1c of greater than 6.5 and a random blood glucose. So a random blood glucose of more than 200 mg per dl with symptoms of hyperglycemia. What are the symptoms of hyperglycemia? Polyphagia, polyuria, polydipsia. So what is polyphagia? It is increased hunger. What is polydipsia? Which is increased in thirst. And what is polyuria? Which is increase in your frequency of micturition or urination. So there are four criteria in the diagnosis of diabetes. Always remember it very nicely. Fasting more than 126, postprandial, that is 2 hours after food more than 200, HbA1c more than 6.5, and random blood glucose more than 200 with symptoms of diabetes. Okay, so coming to the next slide. So I hope you are clear with the diagnosis of diabetes.
Yes.
Okay, so coming to the next slide. So next slide is, suppose you have diagnosed a patient with diabetes and he's on treatment. Okay, So a patient has been diagnosed with diabetes and he's on treatment, whether he's on insulin or whether he's on OHS, that is insignificant. What are your glycemic targets? So how much should your fasting be in a patient of diabetes? So you should always remember the target is a fasting plasma glucose. We target 80 to 130, a postprandial plasma glucose less than 180, and an HbA1c less than 7. These are the American Diabetic Association guidelines for glycemic target in a patient who has been diagnosed with diabetes. So fasting to maintain between 80 to 130, postprandial, that is your after food sugar levels should be maintained, 2 hours after food sugar levels should be maintained less than 180, and an HbA1c should be maintained less than 7. Okay, so another thing I wanted to tell you is about hypoglycemia. So the latest diagnosis and criteria of hypoglycemia has been divided into 3 types. One is level 1, one is level 2, and one is level 3. So what is hypoglycemia? Suppose a patient is on anti-diabetic medication and he has not taken his meals properly, or if he has worked out, he has done some exercise and his sugars start falling. So that is something which can be very dangerous. So low sugars are as equally dangerous as high sugars. So low sugars can lead to brain death if not given glucose immediately. So level 1, any hypoglycemia less than 70 is known as level 1 hypoglycemia. Level 2 has been described less than 54, and level 3 is a severe event characterized by altered mental or physical status requiring assistance for treatment of hypoglycemia. As you would have seen in your daily practice, a patient has come to OPD or casualty. They have come to the hospital with unconsciousness, and you check the blood sugar. It is less than 70. And you start on blood glucose. You give dextrose infusion. The patient improves. So that is level 3, a patient who is unconscious. So you should always remember one thing, that glycemic targets is different for different people. Although the ADA says that HbA1c less than 7, fasting between 80 to 130, and postprandial less than 180 should be maintained in all patients. However, there's a catch. In younger patients, we can go for stricter lifestyle control and strict diabetic control. So in younger patients, we can even target an HbA1c of less than 6.5. Whereas in elder patients, patients who are almost more than 60 or 70 years of age, who have higher chances of hypoglycemia, they should be targeted an HbA1c of 7 to 8 also, depending on their hypoglycemic events. So here we can see disease duration. Newly diagnosed patients should go for a strict diabetes control. Risk potential associated with hypoglycemia and other drug expectorants, if more stringent, if the risk of hypoglycemia is very low, we have to target an HbA1c less than 7. Life expectancy. Suppose there are 2 patients. One is 40 years of age, one is 80 years of age. So a patient with 40 years of age has a greater life expectancy. So in these patients, we go for a strict diabetes control compared to a patient who is 80 years of age. So longer life expectancy, strict diabetes control, less than HbA1c. Important comorbidities present. Again, you have to, if there are many comorbidities in the patient, go for a less strict diabetes control. Establish vascular complications. Suppose the patient has already developed some vascular complications. Patient has developed microvascular or macrovascular complications. Patients have developed nephropathy, neuropathy, cardiac complications. In these patients, the risk of hypoglycemia is very high. So in these patients, again, we go for a less stringent diabetes control. So we maintain a target HbA1c of 7 to 8 in these patients. Highly motivated patients, excellent self-care abilities, and patients who are on strict diabetic diet and can manage their lifestyle and exercise well should go for a strict diabetes control. Resources and support system. Again, if a patient is very poor and he's not being able to afford high quality drugs which have less chances of hypoglycemia, you can go ahead with a less stringent diabetes control. So coming to diabetic ketoacidosis now. So what is the definition of diabetic ketoacidosis? So there are 3 points in the definition of diabetic ketoacidosis. One is hyperglycemia, which is your blood glucose level more than 250 mg per dl. Ketosis, that is your ketone bodies, which are seen either in urine or in blood. And an acidemia, that is an acidic pH of less than 7.3. So these 3 things are helpful in the diagnosis of diabetic ketoacidosis. I'm repeating once again, diabetic ketoacidosis is defined as presence of all 3 of hyperglycemia more than 250 mg per dl, ketosis, that is presence of urine ketone bodies or blood ketones, and acidemia, that is a pH of less than 7.3. So most patients with diabetic ketoacidosis have type 1 diabetes. However, type 2 diabetes patients also are at risk due to catabolic stress of acute illness, such as trauma, surgery, or infections, especially like you have seen now, patients with COVID-19. In patients with COVID-19, there are higher chances of diabetic ketoacidosis, even in patients with type 2 diabetes. So what are the most common precipitating factors? So one of the most common precipitating factors is infection. And the other important precipitating factors of diabetic ketoacidosis includes discontinuation or inadequate insulin therapy. So what happens is you also would have seen in your daily practice that you have started the patient on insulin. Patient has come to you with very high sugar levels, 300, 400, 500. You started the patient on insulin. After 1 or 2 weeks, after 1 month, the patient has checked his blood sugar again and the blood sugar levels have come down to normal. Patient has seen a blood sugar of 100 or 200 and patient is feeling comfortable. The symptoms have come down. What happens is the patient stops insulin. This is one of the most important precipitating causes of diabetic ketoacidosis. In new onset type 1 diabetes also, there are very high chances of diabetic ketoacidosis. Apart from them, some drugs like corticosteroids. Now we have seen, especially in COVID-19 also, some corticosteroids like dexamethasone has been approved. Apart from that, also in septic shock, there are patients who have been given corticosteroids. Sympathomimetic agents like dobutamine, terbutaline, thiazide diuretics like your hydrochlorothiazide, antipsychotics, pentamidine, cocaine, and ecstasy. So these are some of the important drugs which can lead to diabetic ketoacidosis. So this was one of the important studies which they found out. They have taken a number of cases. So these are the number of cases in different centers at Frankfurt, Germany, UK, Switzerland. And they found out that non-compliance was one of the most important causes or precipitating factors in diabetic ketoacidosis. Apart from that, infection, a recent acute myocardial infarction can also lead to the precipitation of diabetic ketoacidosis. So what is the pathophysiology of diabetic ketoacidosis? As we know, there is decreased insulin secretion and there is increase in counter-regulatory hormones. So what happens is there is decrease in insulin and increase in the counter-regulatory hormones, which increase blood glucose levels. So what are these counter-regulatory hormones? Glucagon, catecholamine, cortisol, and growth hormone. These 4 are known as the counter-regulatory hormones, which can lead to hyperglycemia and precipitation of diabetic ketoacidosis. So insulin, as you know, decreases blood glucose. In simple terms, these 4 hormones causes an increase in blood glucose. Glucagon, catecholamine, cortisol, and growth hormone. So hyperglycemia develops as a result of 3 processes. One is glycogenesis, one is glycogenolysis. There is increased free fatty acids, which lead to the formation of ketone bodies. So what happens is insulin causes the prevention of lipolysis. So when insulin is not available, there is increased lipolysis. Increased lipolysis means increased free fatty acids, which lead to the formation of, which acts as a substrate for the formation of ketone bodies. Here we can see the pathophysiology. As I mentioned, absolute insulin deficiency, counter-regulatory hormone increase, hyperlipidemia, increased free fatty acid to liver. In the liver, there is increased formation of ketone bodies, which lead to ketoacidosis. So what are the clinical features? So some of the important clinical features which you should know in patients with diabetes or diabetic ketoacidosis is polyuria, which I have mentioned. It is increase in urination. Polydipsia, which is increase in thirst. Many patients come with weight loss, weakness, nausea, vomiting, and abdomen pain. Apart from that, some signs like fruity odor because of acetone production, decrease in skin turgor because of severe dehydration, Kussmaul's sign, which is increase in the rate and depth of breathing, hypothermia can occur, and patients can always come with altered sensorium in a patient of diabetic ketoacidosis. So what is the diagnostic criteria of diabetic ketoacidosis? So they have divided into three types. One is mild, one is moderate, and one is severe DKA based on some important factors. So plasma glucose more than 2.250, arterial pH, if it is around 7 point, as I've mentioned, less than 7.3 is diabetic ketoacidosis. But when it is between 7.25 to 7.3, it is mild. When it is 7 to 7.24, it is moderate, and less than 7 of pH is categorized as severe diabetic ketoacidosis. Apart from that, even bicarbonate level, which you should know, which you can get by an arterial blood glucose analysis with a ABG. So ABG, you get a bicarbonate between 15 to 18, which is mild, 10 to 14, which is moderate, and less than 10, which is severe. Plasma ketones are positive, urine ketones are positive. Anion gap of more than 12 is moderate to severe. Mental status in mild is alert, whereas in moderate is alert to drowsy, and in severe DKA, patient can go in for stupor or diabetic coma, also known as diabetic ketoacidotic coma. So yeah, so I'm done with the basic pathophysiology and some of the important slides. Now I would go into the management. So whenever you are asked a question about management of any disease, whether it is diabetes, hypertension, thyroid disorder, anything, so you should always speak or answer in 2 points. One, as your investigations. Second, as your treatment. So management would always include your investigations and treatment both. So what are the initial lab investigations you do in a patient with diabetic ketoacidosis? As you know, plasma glucose is important. Then blood glucose, apart from that, creatinine, serum electrolytes. I'll come to the importance of serum electrolytes in the future slides. Serum electrolyte would include your sodium, potassium chloride, serum osmolality, not very commonly done, serum and urine ketones to is the case of diabetic ketoacidosis. A urine analysis, very important. Why? Because most of the patients we have come across have a urinary tract infection which has precipitated the diabetic ketoacidosis event. ABG I have already mentioned, arterial blood glucose analysis, complete blood count with a differential count to rule out any infection. ECG and chest X-ray are again important. ECG to rule out any hyperkalemia or hypokalemia, urine sputum or blood culture based on if the patient has fever. So what is the first thing you do? A patient of diabetic ketoacidosis has come to you. What is the first and foremost management point? Even before insulin, the most important thing is start him on fluid therapy. So these patients are very dehydrated. The administration of insulin without fluid replacement may aggravate the hypotension in these patients. You're also getting a chance to obtain potassium level because before insulin therapy. Okay, this is something which is very important, which I'll come to you again, but I'm telling here also, insulin should not be started in a diabetic ketoacidosis patient before getting a serum potassium level because insulin causes an intracellular shift of potassium which can lead to life-threatening hypokalemia, life-threatening low potassium levels which could lead to arrhythmias and even prove fatal to the patient. So always remember, it is first thing, start fluid therapy, get your regular investigations done, get your serum electrolytes done, and then start on insulin. So how to start on fluid therapy? Fluid therapy is also known to reduce the level of counter-regulatory hormones. It also causes increase in hydration status. It also has some effect of decrease in blood urea nitrogen and blood glucose. And mechanism for lowering glucose by fluid therapy is believed to be osmotic diuresis. So how to give fluids? So in the absence of any cardiac compromise, suppose the patient does not have any cardiovascular abnormalities and his ejection fraction is good, you start on an isotonic saline, which is infused at the rate of 15 to 20 ml per kg body weight per hour. Okay. And based on that, your subsequent choice of fluid may depend. You can either change to 0.45 NaCl infused at 250 to 500 ml per hour if the corrected serum sodium is normal or elevated. However, you can continue at 0.9% NaCl at a similar rate if corrected serum sodium is low. You should always remember that once the plasma glucose has come less than 200, you should start at dextrose. 5% dextrose should be added to the replacement fluid. Why? Because less than 200, you are giving insulin, you are giving fluids, patient is not eating properly, patient may land up in severe hypoglycemia. So coming to insulin therapy. So again, as I have told, insulin should not be given unless serum potassium more than 3.3. So general recommendation is use of IV bolus of regular insulin, 0.1 unit per kg, followed by insulin infusion at 0.1 unit per kg per hour. So 0.1 unit, if a 50-year-old man is there, you give him 10 units of IV, and then you start at an infusion of 0.1 unit per kg per hour. So if a 50 kg man, you started at 5 unit per hour. Okay. So optimal rate of glucose decrement is 50 to 75 mg per hour. If this is not achieved in the first hour, insulin doses may be doubled. So 50 kg man having diabetic ketoacidosis, start him on infusion of 5 units per hour. As you can see, 0.1 unit per kg per hour. So 0.1 into 50 would come to around 5. So start him at 5 units, and based on the further investigations, you can titrate the insulin dose, up titrate it or lower titrate it. So again, as I have mentioned, when plasma glucose is less than 200, fluid has been changed to dextrose 5%, and insulin rate decreased to 0.05 units per kg per hour. We have started on 5 units per kg, and if the patient's blood glucose has come less than 200, decrease the insulin infusion. Rate of insulin should be adjusted to maintain blood glucose between 150 to 200 mg per dl until diabetic ketoacidosis is completely resolved. So this is the target in a patient of diabetic ketoacidosis. You are running fluids, you are giving your insulin infusion, you have to try and titrate in such a way that your sugars are maintained between 150 to 200 mg per dl. It should always be remembered that when the patient has been again titrated from infusion to subcutaneous insulin, you should always overlap with 1 hour of subcutaneous insulin. Okay, so potassium, I was telling you this is very important. Despite total potassium depletion, mild to moderate hypokalemia is common at presentation. So insulin therapy, correction of acidosis and volume expansion can cause further reduction of potassium level. So if serum potassium is greater than 5, no potassium supplement is required. So remember this, serum potassium greater than 5, go ahead with insulin, no need of potassium correction. If potassium is between 4 to 5, add 20 milliequivalent to each liter of replacement fluid after adequate renal function is established. So if potassium is 4 to 5, you add 20 milliequivalents of KCl, which is available. If potassium is 3 to 4, it is the guidelines recommend you add 40 milliequivalents to each liter of replacement fluid. However, if the potassium is less than 3, hold insulin. Don't give insulin. Give 10 to milliequivalents per hour until you get a potassium of greater than 3.3. And then once you have got your more than 3.3, start with 40 milliequivalents to each liter of replacement fluid along with insulin therapy. So potassium replacement is initiated after levels fall below upper level of normal for particular lab also. So you should remember that the goal is to maintain a serum potassium level in the range of around 4 to 5, or 3.5 to 5 is also fine. Okay, so this is a very controversial topic. So there are various recommendations whether to give bicarbonate therapy or not. Because as we know, this is an acidosis state, bicarbonate therapy could be helpful. So what does the guidelines say? So a randomized control trial in 21 patients failed to show any benefit when the pH was between 6.9 to 7.1. So you should always remember that bicarbonate therapy should not be given if the pH is between 6.9 to 7.1. However, if the pH is less than 6.9, bicarbonate therapy is recommended. So no prospective randomized control trials in use of bicarbonate less than 6.5. However, adults with a pH of less than 6.9 should receive 100 millimole of sodium bicarbonate in 400 ml sterile water until the venous pH is greater than 7. So once it is greater than 7, you can stop your bicarbonate therapy. However, if the pH is still little less than 7, the infusion should be repeated every 2 hours until pH reaches more than 7. Apart from that, hypophosphatemia can also cause cardiac and skeletal muscle weakness and also lead to respiratory depression. So careful phosphate replacement may sometimes be indicated in patients with cardiac dysfunction. So especially in a blood phosphate level of less than 1, 20 to 30 milliequivalent potassium phosphate can be added to replacement fluid. So transition to subcutaneous insulin. So when should we stop IV infusion and start again your subcutaneous infusion of insulin? So once the blood glucose is less than 200, bicarbonate is more than 15, a pH of more than 7 has come, and an anion gap of less than 12. So these are the flow criteria. If you have reached this flow criteria, you can stop your insulin infusion and change to a subcutaneous infusion of insulin. Subcutaneous, which is your giving on your skin, either in abdomen or in arms or in the outer side of thighs. So the most preferred site of insulin, you should remember, is the abdominal region. Abdomen region is the most preferred site of insulin therapy. So these are some of the important complications of treatment. One is hypoglycemia. So you should be very careful about hypoglycemia. So hypoglycemia is less than 70 is known as hypoglycemia. Hypokalemia and relapse. So hypokalemia and hypoglycemia is two of the important complications of treatment of diabetic ketoacidosis, which you should be very careful about. Okay, so DKA is preventable. Diabetic ketoacidosis is preventable because we know most common causes of diabetic ketoacidosis is non-compliance. That is, the patient stops insulin or treatment. So as I've already mentioned, if you educate the family and the patient well, that if you stop insulin, it could prove fatal to you. The patient, convince him to take insulin or tablets, whatever he's taking, and to maintain a normal blood glucose range. Sick day guidelines should always be told. So what is sick day guidelines? You should always remember. What are these sick day guidelines? Never omit insulin. Patient has fever. What we see very commonly in our practice is patients stop insulin. They say, sir, bukhar aa gaya tha. We have fever, sir. So we stopped insulin. In fact, in acute condition, stressful condition, insulin doses may even increase. So never stop your insulin. Prevent dehydration and hypoglycemia. Frequent monitoring of blood glucose at home. Monitor for ketosis. Treat underlying triggering cause like infection or cardiovascular cause, and hospital visits regularly. Okay, so I'm done with the presentation of ketoacidosis. Now I will give you some slides upon what is the management of diabetes in an ICU setup. So hospital care delivery. So what do the American Diabetic Association ADA guidelines say? So perform an HbA1c test on all patients with diabetes or hyperglycemia if the sugars are more than 140 mg per dl. Okay, so when caring for hospitalized patients with diabetes, consult with a specialized diabetes team, which includes your diabetologist, endocrinologist, your dietitians. So what are the glycemic targets in hospitalized patients? So as I told you, what are the glycemic targets in normal patients? Suppose a patient is at home, his glycemic target is different. We maintain a fasting blood glucose between 80 to 130, a postprandial or after meal blood glucose less than 180, and an HbA1c of less than 7. But in a patient who has been hospitalized, insulin therapy should be initiated for treatment of persistent hypoglycemia if it is more than 180. So once insulin is started, a target glucose range of 140 to 180 is recommended for majority of the critically ill patients and even non-critically ill patients who are admitted to the hospital or ICU. However, it should be remembered because in younger patients, patients who are young, more stringent goals such as 100 to 140 may be appropriate for very selected patients if they can be achieved without significant hypoglycemia. If the patient develops hypoglycemia, the glycemic target or the blood glucose in a hospitalized patient, the guidelines say should be maintained between 140 to 180. However, if there is no hypoglycemia, you can go for a stricter diabetes control, which would be around 110 to 140. So glucose lowering treatment in hospitalized patients. So basal insulin or a basal plus bolus correction insulin is the preferred treatment for non-critically ill hospitalized patients. A basal includes your long-acting and a bolus includes your short-acting insulin with meals. So an insulin regimen with basal, prandial, and correction components is the preferred treatment for all non-critically ill hospitalized patients with good nutritional intake. You should remember use of only a sliding scale insulin in the inpatient hospital setting is strongly discouraged by the latest American Diabetic Association guidelines. So go with a basal bolus therapy, and based on that, you can again give correction doses. So you can give a basal insulin, which could be either any one of your long-acting insulins, which can be given once daily, and your bolus insulin, which can be given 3 times a day, along with your meals, which is your breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So what is perioperative care? I thought this should also be told. So target range of blood glucose in perioperative period should be around 80 to 180 mg per dl. A preoperative risk assessment should be performed for patients with diabetes who are at high risk for ischemic heart disease and those with autonomic neuropathy or renal failure. You should remember metformin should be withheld on the day of surgery. Withhold any other oral low glucose lowering agents the morning of surgery or procedure. If the patient is on NPH insulin, reduce the dose. Give half of NPH dose or 60 to 80% doses of long-acting analog or pump basal insulin. Monitor blood glucose at least every 4 to 6 hours while patient is taking nothing by mouth, and dose with short or rapid acting insulin as needed. Okay, so I'm done with my slides. Thank you so much for listening very carefully. I hope this information comes to help of each one of you. And now you can go ahead with the question and answer session.
If anyone has any question from participants, please ask. Sir is here to answer your queries. Am I audible?
Yeah, are you audible?
Yes. So please, participants, if anyone has any doubt, any questions, you can ask now.
So
Sir is done
don't
with his-
hesitate if you have any doubts. Although I have tried to put all the basic things into my presentation that would help you even in the long run, how to diagnose, how to manage decay, what are the glycemic targets. These are some very frequently asked questions, which when I ask on rounds also, many of them are not able to answer. In fact, most of them. So if you, apart from this also, you have any doubts, any hesitations, be very free and ask. There is nothing to be ashamed or shy of.
Sir, I had a doubt.
Yeah, ask.
Sir, like what is time in range exactly?
What is?
Time in range.
What range?
Time in range. Actually, I have read it in some articles like
Time and range.
time in range. TIR.
TRI. Try. I am not getting the question.
So it is time.
Aishwarya, you can type it in the chat.
Yeah, if you can type it. Then.
Hello, sir.
Hmm.
She is saying time in range.
Okay, so time in range is something. So time in range is defined as the time spent by a person in normal range. Okay, so what is the normal range? I have already told you. What is your fasting? 80 to 130 and postprandial less than 180 and HbA1c of less than 7. So if you maintain an fasting 80 to 130 and postprandial less than 180, so this is a time of 24 hours. So the time in range is showing how many hours out of those 24 hours your blood sugar is in the normal range. So that is important. The higher the time in range, the better is your glucose control and the less are your chances of developing complications.
So Nikita Tupe has a question. Nikita, please speak. You can unmute yourself, Nikita.
So now, in fact, the important thing you should remember is the concepts are changing. Earlier, we used to tell that there should be a strict glycemic control. HbA1c, as you all would have heard, HbA1c less than 7 is something which you target. Now, it is not just about glycemic targets. There is something new come up which is known as glycemic variability. So, what is glycemic variability? See, if a person suppose have blood sugar levels, someone's blood sugar in evening is around 350. Okay, morning his blood sugar levels are coming to 70. So HbA1c is an average of 3-month blood glucose. So the HbA1c in these patients will come to around the normal range of 7 because patient is undergoing hypoglycemia also and patient has high sugars also. The latest concept is about glycemic variability. There should not be too much variability between your blood glucose levels. You should maintain it between a narrow range of 80 to 180. You should not be like sometimes in the morning it is coming to 50 and 60 and again in the afternoon it is going to 250, 300. So that is bad. So glycemic variability should be minimized. So this is the latest concept of glycemic variability.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I have a question. Like, suppose if I have a dose of insulin at the morning And if I feel hypoglycemic symptoms like dizziness
Yeah.
and all in the morning, should I
Yeah.
go with my insulin dose or should I skip my dose?
So see, whenever you're taking your insulin in the morning, okay, after that, you whatever insulin you're taking, I'll tell you, there are two types of insulin. Either you're taking the short-acting ones. So short-acting ones can lead to hypoglycemia. So short-acting insulins are two types. One is your regular insulin, which is your human actrapid, or which is your fast-acting insulin analogs. So if you are experiencing hypoglycemic symptoms, what are those symptoms? Like increased palpitation, increased sweating, dizziness. What you do is you immediately check your blood sugar levels. When you have checked your blood sugar levels, if it is coming less than 70, from next day onward, decrease your insulin level, decrease your insulin dosage. Don't take the same dosage. Decrease your insulin dosage. Decrease it by 2 to 4 units. And again, with that also, if you are getting hypoglycemic events, again further reduce it. At the dose which your sugar levels are normal and you are not getting blood glucose less than 70 and hypoglycemic symptoms, continue that dose. Understood?
Okay, okay. Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir.
Ah.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you're audible. Tell me.
Yeah, sir, I had read a case in which I don't remember the exact level of glucose in the patient, but it was quite high. And as a result, the prescription was changed and it was prescribed with metformin with glimepiride combination, and vildagliptin. So,
Okay.
sir, I always wanted to know, like, taking so many diabetic, like drugs, like anti-diabetic drugs, will that cause any kind of toxicity or any kind of
No,
severe
no,
effect in the body?
no. So I'll tell you, this is a very good question and a very frequently asked question, because you should remember you can go to 1, 2, 3 drug regimen also, 3 to 4 drug regimen also. What is important you should remember is that your blood glucose should be in the normal range. So whether you're taking 2 drugs or 3 drugs of diabetes also, it is irrelevant. What is important is your blood sugar should be in the normal range. What happens, I'll tell you. If your blood sugars are very high, you are more prone and you develop these microvascular and macrovascular complications very early in your life. Suppose whose blood sugar has been always high towards 400, 500, they will develop nephropathy, neuropathy, cardiac complications in within 5 years or within 10 years. Patients who have maintained a very good blood glucose may not develop complications even after 10 to 15 years. So what is important here is maintain a blood glucose level in the normal range. I've already told you what is the normal range for diabetics. There is something known as glycemic effect, legacy effect, glycemic memory. So you should always remember these two words. One is legacy effect, one is glycemic memory. So what does this legacy effect or glycemic memory means? That when a person has been diagnosed with diabetes, the better the control, the lesser is the chance of developing complications of diabetes. So maintain your blood glucose level in the normal range, your complications would be lessened. So it is irrelevant. Even if he is on 3 drug regimen, don't worry. These are very safe drugs. Only thing is when you're taking a sulfonylurea, which is your glimepiride, you should be careful about hypoglycemia. Okay, so metformin generally does not cause hypoglycemia. Metformin is a very safe drug. Metformin can be taken until unless your creatinine levels are very high. We do not stop metformin. If creatinine levels are very high and your EGFR comes less than 30, then we stop metformin. Apart from that, if EGFR is good, creatinine level is good, continue metformin. Vildagliptin or any other gliptin or SGLT inhibitors can be continued. But glimepiride, if the person is getting hypoglycemias, you have to adjust the dose of glimepiride.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, we have some questions posted in the chat box. Can you please read it, sir? Or shall I read it for you?
Yeah, you can read. I am not getting that chat box.
Okay, sir. So a participant is asking, a few years back, FDA approved the flash glucose monitoring system. Do you think such technologies will help us more in the future? And could you enlighten us about this monitoring system?
Yeah, so flash glucose monitoring, I'm very regularly using in my patients. especially in those patients who are developing hypoglycemia or who are developing very high sugars. So that is something which gives you a 24-hour blood glucose control. Okay, so it gives you an idea about the 24. So what we use here is a Freestyle Libre. So there is something known as Freestyle Libre. It has been promoted by Abbott company. So it is a small sensor which comes here. We place the sensor here and then we place it for a period of 14 days. So we place the sensor here for a period of 14 days and we monitor blood glucose. So I guess every one of you have your mobile phones. So there is a Glimp app in your phone. So whenever you download the Glimp app and you check here like this, it will give your blood glucose levels. So with that 14 days, we get an idea how your glucose is increasing, how your glucose is decreasing. So based on that, if the glucose levels in these 14 days, we are seeing a consistent rise, like, okay, after breakfast, your glucose has been on the higher side daily. We would ask you more about your breakfast. If the glucose has been higher after lunch, we would ask you more about your lunch details. So this is important. And then with diet and lifestyle modification, also we can lead to a better glycemic control. So flash glucose monitoring, I've been regularly using and it is very helpful in management of diabetes.
Sir, to add on to this question, sir.
Huh.
Sir, like, hello.
Tell.
Hello.
I can hear you. Tell. Hello. Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yeah. What is the question? Please ask now.
We guess she's muted herself, so you could take in the other questions.
Sir, should I read out the next question for you?
Yes.
Yeah. A patient. How practical is the use of insulin pump in hospital and outpatient settings, and its advantage or disadvantage over traditional monitoring?
What? How?
How practical is the use of insulin pump in just a minute.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me? Actually, there.
Yeah. Tell me.
Yes, sir. Like, does that device need any calibration before, like, actually?
That calibration can be done on they will do it in the computer level itself. That is not a big issue. So we have done it, calibrated it also. And we always, when we are checking it, we compare it with a blood glucose level. So we do it with a glucometer and we see a blood glucose level with glucometer, a plasma glucose level by vein, and a measurement of CGMS also. So these three things are monitored at the same time.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. The question I had was like, when we use an insulin pen, so is it like different needles have different amount of insulin delivered? Like, because during my OPD posting, I had seen a patient who was actually using the wrong needle and more amount of insulin was getting delivered. Like the units were something like it had to be adjusted. So can you please tell us about those?
No. What you would have read is, I'll tell you what commonly people do. So there are two insulin. This problem does not arise in pens. So pens have a good dial system. So number of units can be dialed in pen and can be given easily. So this problem does not arise in pens. This problem arises in insulin syringes. So what happens is there are two types of syringes available. One is 40 IU, what is your 40 units, and one is your 100 IU, which is your 100 units. So you should always remember, you should see the vial. So if it is a 40 IU vial, you should use a 40 unit syringe, which is your Actrapid or your regular insulin. You would have seen it is 40 U written. So in these patients, you use 40 IU syringe, 40 unit syringe. However, when you have seen your patients like patients who are on Basalog or longer acting insulin, like patient is very frequently use Glargine or Basalog and your Lantus. What happens is patients who are not using pens, some of them will come up with only a cartridge. So they will have the Lantus cartridge or the Basalog cartridge, but they will not have insulin pen. When you are using an insulin pen, it is very easy. It is calibrated. You straight away dial the amount of insulin should be taken and you can give. But when the patient does not have a pen, he has only the vial and you have the insulin syringe. In that, you have to see the vial. If it's 100 IU, you should inject with a 100 units, 100 IU syringe itself. If it is 40, you should go for a 40 IU syringe. I hope that answered the question.
Aishwarya?
Thank you so much, sir.
So there's another question
Hmm.
that a student has asked. If a student is having a blood glucose level above 155, what are the things to be done to control the situation?
So 155 random or postprandial or fasting, that is important. So a fasting glucose more than or 126 is diabetes. So random blood glucose we categorize as pre-diabetes and diabetes. So RBS between 140 to 199 is known as pre-diabetes. A random blood glucose of 140 to 199 is known as pre-diabetes, whereas a random blood glucose of more than 200 is diabetes with symptoms, which I've shown you in the first slide. This is the slide. See, this is the first slide. You have seen a random blood glucose more than 200 is diabetes, but 140 to 199 is pre-diabetes. So patients with pre-diabetes, your 164 is lying in this range, should go for a strict diabetic monitoring. They should go for lifestyle exercises and diabetic diet. So these are the two things we recommend: a diabetic diet and a lifestyle modification. Daily exercise, walk in the form of brisk walk 30 minutes a day. Any exercise for 30 minutes a day is good enough. But most important, you should try for aerobic exercises also, like a brisk walk of 30 minutes per day. Reduce your carb intake, reduce your sugar intake, reduce your fruit intake, which can lead to increased blood glucose, like your mangoes or your maida items. Reduce your rice items, rice, potatoes, these things, a diabetic diet and exercise. So we generally do not recommend tablets or metformin in patients with pre-diabetes. But if the patient develops diabetes, then we have to start on treatment. Understood? Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. And there's another question from a student. He wants to know about the post-transplant diabetes.
So post-transplant diabetes is very commonly seen nowadays. So post-transplant diabetes could be because of two important things. One is infections and one is because of your immunosuppressive agents. Most commonly we use is steroids, which can lead to increase in blood sugar levels post-transplant. So all these immunosuppressives can cause increase in blood sugar levels. So you have to monitor it. There is nothing to worry. Either go with tablets or insulin. Most of the tablets are safe. Apart from metformin, if the creatinine is on the higher side, you should not take metformin if the creatinine is very high. Apart from that, DPP-4 inhibitors or your sulfonylureas are pretty safe in post-transplant diabetes also. But the best is insulin therapy. If the sugars are not controlled, you can go switch to insulin therapy. And you should remember that your insulin doses and your tablet doses will come down based on the tapering of your steroid or immunosuppressive doses also.
Okay, thank you, sir. So there's one more question regarding the same insulin pump. I'll read out that question. How practical is the use of insulin pump in hospitals and outpatient settings, and its advantages or disadvantages over traditional monitoring?
Okay. So this is a very good question. So insulin pump is something which we mainly use for type 1 diabetes. So we generally do not use for type 2 diabetes because type 2 diabetes is a state of insulin resistance. So you can give tablets along with insulin, but in type 1 diabetes, especially patients who have uncontrolled type 1 diabetes, then there is a choice. Either go for a multi insulin regimen, multi drug regimen, which is your frequent monitoring of blood glucose with basal and bolus regimen. That is, you give a long-acting bolus, a basal unit, and 3 short-actings of bolus, whether it's your Actrapid or your Novorapid, whatever you're taking with food. But still, if the sugars are not controlled, patient can go in for insulin pumps. The only disadvantage some of my patients have felt is that they always feel that there is a pump here. So you have to fix the pump in the abdomen. So that is causes some amount of discomfort for the patient. So that is something which is a disadvantage. And if the pump suddenly stops working, patient can be prone for diabetic ketoacidosis. So pump stops working suddenly, patients would be prone for diabetic ketoacidosis. So patient should be very careful about that. Secondly, it causes little inconvenience for the patient because young boy, he wants to play cricket, badminton, football, and he has something on the abdomen, could be a little uncomfortable. But the biggest advantage is that patient with pumps have a very good blood glucose control. So blood glucose control I have seen is very good with pumps. So there is an increase in life expectancy. Why? Because since the blood glucose control is very good, there are lesser chances of developing complications, that is your microvascular and macrovascular complications of diabetes. So it gives a good blood glucose control. But again, most of my patients are on multi-drug regimen itself. Very few patients are on pumps. So most of them are very good controlled with your subcutaneous insulin only.
Thank you, sir. So there's one more question. The risk of hemiplegia in association with DKA.
Okay, so what happens is these are associations. There is no proof confirmation that hemiplegia can occur, but yeah, sugars very high can lead to stroke. So CVA, sugars have been for a very high for a very long time can lead to your thrombosis, and it could lead to your CVA, which is your cardiovascular abnormalities, which include your stroke or ischemic heart diseases. So yeah, obviously hemiplegia is type of a cerebrovascular accident. So patients with diabetes who have been having uncontrolled diabetes for a very long time, they have higher propensity of getting stroke or ischemic cardiac events. So you should always try to maintain blood glucose in the normal range. Even in patients who have developed hemiplegia, if we go for a strict blood glucose control, we have seen good improvement in the future run also.
Okay. So moving on to the next question. If a person is feeling hypoglycemic and does not have any sugar substitute to handle and control it, in that case, what can be done?
He can take some chocolate, he can take biscuits. Just check your sugar level. If it is less than 70, any chocolate available, any biscuits available, he can take that also. Or Glucon-D powder also can be taken. Or especially in patients who are diabetes and who have frequent hypoglycemia, there is something known as HypoTab. There's a tablet itself which is available. So many patients of mine who have had frequent hypoglycemic events, I have told them to keep that tablet. That is dextrose tablet. It is known as HypoTab. I have told them to keep it with them. So any symptoms of hypoglycemia, I tell them to check. If it is coming less than 70, less than 60, straight away take that tablet, which is known as dextrose tablet, HypoTab. Apart from that, if you don't have anything, you can take a chocolate or a biscuit. Or
Okay,
even your sugar can be taken. No issues.
Yes, sir.
These are all substitutes.
Moving on to the next question. If a unconscious patient comes in ER, then after checking the fruity odor, what is the line of treatment should we directly start the treatment or wait for blood test reports?
I have already discussed this in all my slides that blood glucose should be measured. Then you have to measure your electrolytes and then start at least on fluid therapy. So if ketone bodies are present and sugars are very high, more than 250, then you have to start on fluid. So once you are confirmed with the diagnosis of diabetic ketoacidosis, plasma glucose, I'll hardly tell you 30 seconds it will take. You just do a plasma glucose more than 250, ketone bodies are present, you do an ABG, pH is less than 7.3, start on treatment. Start with fluids, wait for your electrolytes. If electrolytes are normal, start with insulin therapy.
Yes, sir, there's one more question. So if there's a patient is having a foot ulcer, but his diabetes is like in control with the meds. So what measure do the should be taken?
So yeah, so this is a very, very important question because diabetes is one of the most important causes of foot amputations. So what happens is, you have heard of something known as diabetic neuropathy. That is one of the important microvascular complications of diabetes. So a long-standing diabetes or a very uncontrolled diabetes leads to weakening of your nerves. So what happens is the patients are unable to feel the sensation. So what happens in a normal person, if you get hit by a stone, you will get hurt. But in diabetic patients who have lost their sensation, they do not get that feeling of hurt. Since they do not get pain, we ask all our diabetic patients, when they have come home in the night, they should wash their feet, they should moisturize their feet, and they should see if there are any ulcers in their feet daily at the night, so that early and appropriate management can be done. So all diabetic patients should come back in the night before sleeping. They should wash their feet, they should properly moisturize their feet, and they should look for introspect for examine for any ulcer. If the blood glucose level are under control, then you have to manage only the ulcer. You don't have to worry about the blood glucose level. Keep the blood glucose level in control and manage the ulcer. The ulcer will start improving. Moreover, in especially ulcer patients, it is recommended to start insulin because insulin has healing properties also. So insulin acts on the IGF-1 and it causes angiogenesis and it causes early healing of wounds. So in patients who have ulcers, we recommend insulin more than your OHs because insulin has additive advantage of angiogenesis and healing properties, which your oral medications don't have. I hope that has answered the question.
Yes, yes, sir. Thank you. So there's a next question. Is there any calculation of DNS that is needed for patients presenting with hypoglycemia in ER?
So hypoglycemia in ER, just give a 25% dextrose. So earlier we used to tell the 15 rule, 15 gram of glucose should be given and you have to check 15 minutes later, 15 mg of mgdl will rise. Okay, so there was something known as the rule of 15. You give 15 gram of glucose in a hypoglycemic patient, check glucose again after 15 minutes and you see there's a rise of 15 mg per dl of glucose. But now it is not recommended. The latest guidelines mentioned to give 25 gram glucose. So you can start with if an unconscious patient, you can straight away give dextrose 25%. And later, 15 to 20 minutes later, you again check the blood glucose level and you can repeat it if the sugars have not risen. However, in very serious, critically ill patients, you have to give infusion also if the sugars have not come up. But generally, most of our patients with 25% dextrose, they improve.
Okay. So there's our next question. Post-operative care and complications that can be outlook after surgery.
Yeah, so after surgery, generally what we maintain is we discharge the patient and keep the patient on insulin for at least 1 or 2 months, especially in big surgeries like your cardiac surgeries and all, where again, as I have mentioned, insulin has healing properties also. So in cardiac patient who has undergone cardiac bypass, you would come across a big wound. So insulin leads to better glycemic control and even helps in wound healing. So what we do is post-op patients, we generally discharge on insulin and then follow them up. So once in next 1 or 2 months, when the wound has completely healed, we can again switch them over to oral anti-diabetic drugs.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, a participant, Ashok Jezurkar, says that. So, you said corticosteroids are used in COVID-19 patients, and when patient is already having DM or DK risk, then what's the treatment option to control
So you go,
cytokine?
yeah.
Yes.
So what happens is now the latest studies have shown an improvement in mortality rate by giving dexamethasone because it improves the cytokine storm and it reduces inflammation. But again, dexamethasone can lead to your flare up of your diabetic status. So what we do is we ensure that the patient has good glucose control, and based on that, after that you can start your dexamethasone, but go according to your glucose control. You have to give dexamethasone, there is no option, but you can increase the insulin doses and maintain and keep the glucose in the normal range with increased glucose doses, insulin doses. And once your dexamethasone has stopped, then you decrease and titrate the insulin doses to the normal levels, whatever the patient was taken previously.
So there's one more question. People with diabetes, mainly their foot color gets changed, mainly black, brown, or gray, or dark marks are there. How to care this?
That is what I told. In the initial phase itself, you have to make sure your blood sugar is in the normal range. This is something known as legacy effect and glycemic memory. So the better your blood glucose control, the better are your chances and the lesser are your chances to develop the dermatological complications of diabetes. All these pigmentation, bullosis, all these occur with very high blood sugar levels. So generally you have to keep a blood sugar level in the normal range, and regular foot examination, even a minor mark or a thing should be reported and should be managed in a well cared manner. So once that is recovered, it recovers completely. But if the person keeps neglecting and the foot color or the foot problem has reached a stage where there has been complete discoloration of blackish, then patient has to undergo amputation. So that is why it is very important to daily inspect your feet at the night before going off to sleep. Moisturize your feet, wash your feet, look for any wound or ulcerations, and report it to your doctor. I hope that has answered the question.
Yes, sir. So I guess the questions are done. If
Okay.
anyone is having any question, you can ask it.
Anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself. You can ask. We'll take few more questions if you have any. So I think that's it.
So
I think questions are done.
just a minute, Trevor.
Yes,
So
yes.
So what is the risk of is there any difficulty in managing the DK or DM in association with the psychiatric disorders?
Yeah, so as I've told, see, this is the slide which I've shown you. So psychiatric disorders are a little difficult to manage because all these second generation antipsychotics can cause precipitation of your DKA. So these patients are very prone for hypoglycemias also because they will not take their insulin properly, and if they take, they may take a higher dose. So they need someone to take care of them. So in these patients, when the patients are completely fine, we avoid drugs which causes hypoglycemia. We go for metformin and all, and we use insulin again which causes less hypoglycemia. So in that manner we can use something like insulin analogs, the faster acting insulin analogs, or the long-acting analogs which have lesser chances of hypoglycemia. So this is something which we follow in psychiatric patients.
Yes, sir. So there's one more question I had. There was a case where a lady, 48-year-old lady, was a known case of DM, hypertension, and CVA. So I guess, actually she had missed her insulin dose, and she got the risk of DK, and then later on she had ulcer, foot
Okay.
ulcer, and she also had psychiatric disorder, and later on she had UTI as well. So at
Okay.
such conditions where we have so many comorbid conditions, so what is the first attention we give, like which
So first
thing?
attempt you should go for is a good glycemic control. So see, first attention is you have to go for a good glycemic control. Along with that, if the patient has UTI, you get a urine routine examination, and don't start antibiotics before getting a urine culture. So as soon as the patient has come, you know patient has UTI, you have seen microscopy, there are pus cells present, there are leukocytes present in urine, straight away go for an urine culture and sensitivity. Once you have sent for urine culture and sensitivity, start an antibiotic as a prophylactic antibiotic, and you maintain your blood glucose levels in the normal range. Once the sensitivity reports have come, then based on the antibiotics the susceptible organism is sensitive to, you can go and switch over to that antibiotic. So that is for your UTI. Blood sugar level, generally in UTI patients who are hospitalized, we go for insulin therapy. We generally don't go for your OHS. So which OHA can cause UTI? I think you all would know the latest wonder drug SGLT2 inhibitors, which includes your empagliflozin, dapagliflozin, canagliflozin, ertugliflozin. These are known as wonder drugs because they have shown to have cardiovascular mortality benefit in patients with diabetes. So patients who are on these drugs have reduced mortality. But again, this comes with some risk of increase in UTI. So a person who's taking SGLT2 inhibitors, stop that drug. A person who's taking SGLT inhibitors, stop that and go for insulin and maintain insulin, maintain blood glucose in the normal range, go for the susceptible antibiotic and treat him according to that condition. Apart from this, supportive therapy can be given based on the electrolytes and other factors. So one thing you should remember is to prevent your complications, three things are important. Be known as A, B, C. What is A? A stands for A1C. So HbA1c should be under control. B stands for blood pressure. Blood pressure should be under control. C stands for cholesterol. So your LDL cholesterol should be under control. So your A, B, C are under control. You will get less chances of developing any cardiovascular or cerebrovascular accident.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Sir,
So
there is one
there's
question
more
in chat
question
box.
from a
Yeah.
participant.
Yes, Ritika, go ahead.
Can paradoxin be used in diabetic neuropathy?
Pyridoxine can be used in diabetic neuropathy if there is deficiency. Apart from that, for pain, we give pregabalin, duloxetine, and amitriptyline. But pyridoxine can be used, especially if there is deficiency. So that is just a multivitamin type. So you can use it. There is no harm. Especially in peripheral neuropathy, you have to get a vitamin B12 level done. If the vitamin B12 level done, you have to use your cyanocobalamin and you have to replace with vitamin B12. Apart from that, with severe painful peripheral neuropathy, you use pregabalin. If it is not controlled with pregabalin, you go for amitriptyline or your duloxetine. Pyridoxine can be benefit, but it will not cause a reduction in pain. So painful neuropathies, you generally go for pregabalin.
So there's one more question. What is HOMA-IR? How is it helpful?
So HOMA-IR is nothing but it is the way of calculating insulin resistance. So based on there are two values which is taken. One is your fasting blood glucose and your insulin levels. So based on a formula, they calculate the HOMA-IR. So based on that, you get to know how much is your insulin resistance. If your insulin resistance is high, then you have to go for drugs which are your metformin and other drugs which can reduce your insulin resistance. This is mainly used for research purposes. So there are some conditions like FCPD, like fibrocalculous pancreatic diabetes. So what happens in these patients? Some say it is because of insulin deficiency, some say because of insulin resistance. To find out if it is actually because of insulin deficiency or resistance, we do an HOMA-IR and we know if there is insulin resistance along with insulin deficiency. So these are mainly used for research purposes also, but HOMA-IR can be used for your calculation of insulin resistance.
Yes, thank you. So I guess that we are done with the questions. Shubham, can you please take over?
Yes, Aishwarya will give the vote of thanks to sir. Aishwarya. Aishwarya, you are, please unmute yourself.
Sorry.
It's okay.
So it was a very interactive session, and you covered like totally from the diagnosis to the management of diabetes, and we all enjoyed it, and we could actually get our questions answered by you. So thank you for it. So I would like to thank Dr. Anupam Biswas sir for his marvelous presentation. He combined all the knowledge together, and we could actually use it for the practical experience during our hospital posting. On behalf of the IPSF, its president Ayush Gandhi, and other office bearers, I would like to thank, and on the behalf of all the participants, I would like to thank you, sir. I sincerely thank Dr. Anupam Biswas sir for this webinar. During such during such a pandemic, also you took out time for our IPSF and you spoke during this webinar and you enlightened us regarding the management. So thank you so much, sir. Lastly, I would also like to thank the participants for taking out time and attending our session. Thank you so much.
Thank you and all the best to all of you.
And lastly, I would like to request all the participants to open up the camera so that we can take a photo of today's session. Please be quick. And also, I would like to inform all participants that today's recorded session of today's event will be available on our YouTube channel of IPSF Pune. So whenever you want to revisit, you can just go there and brush up with sir's slides, which are helpful and informative.
Are we done?
Done, sir. Thank you so much.
Yes, done. Thank you all the participants. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, just send me a link of the presentation also. Okay, on YouTube.
Yes, sir, sure.